So Freedom School is a new initiative that was started by the Rutgers AAUP-AFT, which is the faculty grad and faculty union. And it's really in the tradition of the Highlander School and the Black Panther Freedom Schools, Liberation Schools, to think about a space for really to build community and to think about political education, not only by people that we invite from the outside, but from one another. So it's in that spirit that we brought Freedom School together. We're gonna have a really vibrant schedule for Freedom School next year. We are planning on doing a number of different Freedom Schools, essentially every 2 weeks. We will be doing one on New Jersey ICE and the organizing against it. We're also planning a Freedom School on questions of adjunctification and the role of teaching faculty, as we like to call them, also known as part-time lecturers, and thinking about that in relationship to gig organizing, tech workers. We'll also be having one on Mountain View at prison organizing and prison abolition. So we have a number of ones coming up. So we hope that you will tune in. Be your regular Thursday night, what should we call it, communing. So I'm going to introduce our two speakers, and I just want to say, I want to thank them and say how honored we are to have them. Both Juan González, who will be talking tonight, and Melanie Price have done such foundational work on electoral politics and really countering the narrative that many of us have suffered through since the election, the presidential and down ballot elections in early November, in which the Edison polls, these exit polls, were used to make all these kinds of suppositions about the nature of Trump's support. So Juan González is pioneering journalism of this. I've been following it from the very first, and also Melanie Price's very important writings about Black women, politics, and Stacey Abrams are absolutely crucial parts of this discussion. It was so frustrating in that week as we were watching all of the voter information filter in, seeing it on the mainstream media, this discussion of the Electoral College and the flipping, especially of Georgia and other states, with no discussion of the people on the ground, the demographics, and also the role of organizing and Black, brown people as being absolutely central to this question about the outcome of the 2020 election. So this is our counterpoint to that and our chance to go straight to the people that have done much of the original writing and research about this. So without further ado, I will introduce them and then we will begin our discussion. Juan González is the Richard B. Heffner Professor of Communications and Public Policy and Professor of Professional Practice in Journalism and Media Studies at Rutgers, a staff columnist for the New York Daily News from 1987 until 2016. He is also the longest running co-host of Democracy Now!, which airs on more than 1,500 public and community TV and radio stations throughout the US and Latin America. I think this is how almost all of us start our mornings. His columns and investigative reports have won numerous distinctions, including 2 George Polk Awards for commentary. He is the author of 5 books, among them Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America, and News for All the People, The Epic Story of Race and American Media. A founder and past president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, Juan González was the first Latino to be named to the Society of Professional Journalists New York Journalism Hall of Fame, and has also been elected a fellow of the New York Academy of History. During the late 1960s, he was the leader in the Young Lords Party, and he later served as the first president of the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights. Professor Melanie Price, who is our much beloved colleague who we miss, who once taught in the Department of Africana Studies. This is her homecoming and return to Rutgers, and we are absolutely thrilled. She is now an endowed professor of political science at Prairie View A&M University and the principal investigator for their African American Studies Initiative, which is funded by grants and gifts from the Mellon Foundation. Dr. Price was recently named the inaugural director of the Ruth J. Simmons Center for Racial Justice. Her research and teaching interests include Black politics, public opinion, political rhetoric, and social movements. Her most recent book, The Race Whisperer, Barack Obama and the Political Uses of Race, from New York University Press, 2016, examines the multiple and strategic ways that President Obama uses race to deflect negative racial attitudes and engage with a large cross-section of voters. Her first book, Dreaming Blackness, Black Nationalism and African-American Public Opinion, NYU 2009, examined the contemporary support for Black nationalism. Her new project is called Mountaintop Removal, Martin Luther King, Trump, and the Racial Mountain, which uses MLK's mountaintop speech as a lens for understanding the rise of Trump and the 2016 election. Before coming to Prairie View, she was an associate professor of Africana Studies and Political Science at Rutgers, and she previously taught at Wesleyan University and was an inaugural professor for Wesleyan's College in Prison program at Cheshire Correctional Facility, a maximum security men's prison. Professor Price did election commentary on the 2016 election season on Philadelphia's NBC 10. She is a regular contributor for the New York Times opinion section and has also done political commentary for CNN, Ms. Magazine, the Hartford Courant, Vox, Pacifica, NYC, and CT Public Radio. So let's all give them a very warm Zoom hand for coming today. So I thought it might be good just to jump right into this. This kind of follows up from my opening remarks. After the presidential election in November, there was a lot of emphasis on the Edison exit polls that showed that there had been an increase in Black and brown vote for Trump. A number of commentators drew quite dramatic conclusions about the, quote, multicultural, multiracial nature of Trump's win. There was even a political science professor, when interviewed about this, that said that this was indeed the transcendence of identity politics. Can you talk about the problems of this analysis and offer some alternative lenses to think about the results? How should we understand the racial politics of the 2020 presidential and down ballot elections? Whoever would like to start.
Well, Melanie, do you want to start?
Sure, we're both very polite people. First of all, I think it's so interesting the way in which people are now, like, they know that it's the Edison exit poll and they know which exit polls are coming from particular places. And there's a level of interest in the details of politics that has made my job harder, but also it has destroyed some of those myths about things that are sort of the standard bearers in how we think about elections. I think the answer that we all sort of are expecting about the racial breakdown is that this election and in 2016, one of the things that we see is that there is a clear delineation between white voters and who they're willing to support and everybody else. And white voters bet on Trump. Well, let me just say this. White voters don't vote for the Democratic Party in the majority. And they haven't in years, since the I want to say Lyndon Johnson, but that might just be
Johnson presidency.
But way back. Anyway, I'm very sleepy. This has been a very long day. Haven't done that in a very long time. But where we see this, the difference is that so many categories in 2016 where you expect reliably Democratic white voters, they didn't show up in the ways that were expected. And in some ways they improved their standing in 2020, but we still see that when we think about electoral politics, it really is a very large number of whites mixed in with a small number of other groups of color.
Thank you.
Yes, well, I think I agree with you that everyone is now beginning to understand what this Edison National Exit Poll is, because we have to understand that whether you're watching CNN or reading the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times or Fox News, they're all getting their data from the same poll. They chip in money because none of them wants to spend the money individually to conduct this poll. So they pool their money and they give it to the Edison research firm to come up with this national exit poll. Of course, the exit poll has had problems in recent years as more and more people are voting by mail ballot or in early ballot, that it's no longer an exit poll of the particular day of the election. And so they've had to recalibrate and basically estimate how many people are actually going to come out to vote in person on election day versus early on. And but it's one poll. Now AP has started a competing poll, but it doesn't have the kind of subscription levels that the Edison Research Project does. So they basically, this one monopoly pretty much determines how all the media are going to interpret the election. So we have to understand from that point, if there's problems with that poll, then there's problems with all of our understanding of what actually happened. And I think the key things when I began to look at the exit poll, because even though I know that it's been questioned, especially in the Latino community by a variety of political scientists who have challenged it, because the exit poll has been in existence as a monopoly since 2004. There have been others previously, but that's basically when it got the contract with all the media companies. And the criticism that's been put forth by the Latino political scientists is, number one, that it undersamples overwhelmingly Latino voting districts. It tends to do its exit polls in more multiracial areas where not only Latinos, but others are. It undersamples the number of people who are Spanish dominant and vote and basically operate in Spanish. It also tends to, and this is a problem with all polls, it tends to sample those who are more educated than less educated. And for years, it has always oversampled the percentage of Cuban American, largely Cuban American precincts in the overall Latino vote. So all of these things have skewed in the past the results of the Edison exit poll. At a certain point, so many African American and Latino and Native American political scientists became upset that they created an alternative poll, which is called the American, it's the AAEP, the American, the AEEP, the American Election Eve poll. And they conduct their own poll before the election, but primarily of also people who've already voted. And they have their own poll that they put out on election eve. And this is many of the organizations in the African American, Latino, Native American, and Asian American community depend on that poll, although it's barely known in major media.
Right.
And so they have questioned repeatedly the problems with this poll. So what happened? What are the problems here? I think the key thing that we have to understand is, as everyone knows, this was an historic election in numbers. 159 million people voted. When the final counts are in, that's about between 159 and 160. 159 million people voted. That is an extraordinary increase, about 15% over 2016. And the greatest percentage in 100 years in terms of actual turnout. So the question is then, who were those 159 million people? Who were they? Because the percentages are not as important as the actual numbers. And so I think one of the things that Matt Barreto, who's a political scientist who runs the UCLA Latino Politics and Latino Policy Initiatives program, he immediately criticized the results of the Edison poll. Now, when I started putting my first analysis on Democracy Now! In the couple of days after the election, there was only the Edison poll to depend on. So I just looked at the Edison poll. What does it show? It shows that they claim that 13% of those 159 million people who voted were Latino, that 12% of the 159 million people who voted were African American. So you do the quick math, right? 13% of 159 million people is 20.6 million. So that said to me, according to Edison, the official poll of all the networks, that 20.6 million people, Latinos, voted. When I look at the previous election, which is 2016, and there we have more reliable figures because the Census Bureau does its own survey about 8 months after an election, which they're going to publish in the summer of next year. And that's actually the most accurate numbers. The Census Bureau said that in 2016, its survey of the American people showed that 12.6 million Latinos voted in 2016. So if that's true, if Edison is right, there was a phenomenal increase in the Latino vote of about 8 million people, 63% increase in just 4 years. There was a considerable increase in the African-American vote and also in the Asian-American vote, if you go by Edison Poll and by the actual verifiable number of 159 million people. And so that's the first thing to understand, that the issue to me in this election was not whether Trump increased a few percentage points in the African-American vote or in the Latino vote, but what was the total turnout? Was there an enormous increase, which there was in the Latino community, and it appears to be in the African-American and the Asian-American community. And so I think that's the key issue of this election was the historic turnout and what drove people to come out and who came out. Those are the key issues. Now, Matt Barreto actually says, because I've had numerous discussions with him in the last few weeks as he's compiling UCLA's numbers.
Can I just interrupt here because you can't put it in the chats to say that Matt Barreto's project is called Latino Decisions, if you want to look it up. Okay.
Well, no, Latino Decisions is his consultancy project.
Right.
Which
but they have data up on their website. If
right. They do political consulting work, but the research is largely done by UCLA's Latino research, policy research initiatives, of which Matt is a professor of political science at UCLA. So he has like two hats. He does his political consultancy and then he does his research at UCLA. And he actually claims that the Edison poll overestimated the Latino percentage. He believes from the data that they've looked at that the actual number will probably be closer to 10.5% rather than 13%, that African-Americans still voted in higher numbers than Latinos in this past election, and that still represented 16.7 million Latino voters, which is about a 33% increase. Now, remember, the national increase was 15%. So Latinos went about 33% by the low figure, which is Matt's. The high figure is Edison project, but we won't know the real figure until we find out what the Census Bureau comes up with next summer. So we're all looking at the parameters. Regardless of how you look at it, this was historic turnout in the Latino community, which I think is the first thing that has to be understood. The second is that Trump's percentage of the Latino vote is pretty much in the historic pattern of all Republican candidates going back 30 years. In fact, George Bush did much better among Latinos. The only one who did worse than Trump was Romney in 2012. McCain did just about as good as Trump did. There's always been about a third of the Latino community that has voted Republican. When it gets up into the 40% is when you have real problems, when Democrats have real problems. But between 25 and 30%, that's ballpark. That's ballpark. So the issue is not, was there a percentage increase here or there? Who turned out? What was the turnout? And I think that's the key thing to understand. The other thing to understand is the where that turnout occurred, because all the focus has been on Miami-Dade and South Texas and the Rio Grande Valley. But as Barreto has been able to analyze, that where the turnout mattered was in Pennsylvania, was in Wisconsin, was in Arizona, and was in Nevada. And according to those figures, and from what they've been able to find out, I'll get you the numbers right here. For instance, Maricopa County, Arizona, 78% Latino support for Biden. Pima County, Arizona, 81%. Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania, 77%. Lehigh County, which is where Allentown is, a majority Latino city, 76%. Milwaukee County, 77%. So it's in the counties in the battleground states where there was an extraordinarily high Latino turnout for Biden, and that helped to deliver those states. The third point that very few people mention, which I try to raise more often, is that we are seeing the emergence in the United States of a new political brown belt. The brown belt of the United States, and a lot of people are familiar with the black belt of the South. There's a brown belt that has increasingly developed in the United States, which is 5 states: California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Texas. Half of all the Latinos in the United States live in those 5 states. In those 5 states, they currently represent 38% of the entire population of the states. And so increasingly, it is those states that are going to shape, I think, the development of new political alignments in the future. Arizona just turned. Arizona now has 2 Democratic senators. For the first time, as long as people can remember, the first time it's voted for a Democrat. The only one time Bill Clinton won it once, but since 1952, no Democratic president has ever won Arizona, except for Bill Clinton his first time. So Arizona has now turned, and Texas is the last one to go. It didn't go this time.
We're coming. We're coming. I'm sitting in Texas right now. We're coming.
Texas is coming. And once Texas turns, politics in America will never be the same again. It will force a realignment of the political parties, and a lot of that is driven by the surge of this new brown belt, which all happens to be the old Mexican territories, but which increasingly Latinos have concentrated in those states, and they now affect, even if it's a 2-to-1 split. Would you prefer, as I say before, would you prefer 70% of 10 million votes or 65% of 20 million votes? How do you win? Where do you win more votes? And I think that is what's happening. So those are the key lessons of this, one, there was unprecedented turnout. We have to see who turned out. It was people of color. 2 is that in those key battleground states, people of color played a much bigger role. And 3, that there is the emergence rapidly in this country of a new brown belt in the Southwest of the United States.
Can I add to the part that you said on the end, which is one of the things that this means is now with the South becoming more competitive in places like Georgia and South Carolina, and you have the Southwest in play, the Democratic Party has tons of routes potentially to the White House, and Republican routes to the White House have become narrow. And at the moment that Texas goes blue, it becomes almost impossible for them to make it to the White House. And so that's the thing that's critical about understanding the way in which Arizona flipped this time, the way in which Georgia flipped this time, is to know that if these things can be repeated, then Republicans have a very hard road to the White House. And Democrats have multiple roads to the White House. That is, they can win in lots of different ways with lots of different configuration of states, as opposed to the set of states. So Donald Trump, basically, if they had called 3 states on election night, which they didn't, Florida and a couple of other ones, if they had called them, he was done. Joe Biden had a much wider map, and so they could say, well, he lost that one, and you could just go to plan B. Or if he lost another one, you could go to plan C. And that's not available to Republicans as long as you continue to see this turnout.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. And also thinking about the gerrymandering, the fight over redistricting, and the incredible anxiety of the Republican Party about allowing people to vote. One follow-up question I wanted to ask about this, especially in thinking about Texas, was also in the way that Juan sketched those percentages of the Black and brown vote. I'm curious to hear from both of you about Black-brown coalitions, electoral and political coalitions in these states that we've talked about, and how we might talk about that in the way that it's currently shaping electoral politics now and in the future.
It's a complicated story. There are moments when you see lots of collaboration, and then there are moments when the nature of the ways in which we have limited seats for people of color leads to increased competition. One of the bright notes, I think, in Georgia is that the same type of organizing that Stacey Abrams and Endowed and people like that were doing for African Americans, you have parallel organizations in the Latino community and in the Asian American community who are also doing that work, and they are all working in tandem. That partially is because in Georgia, the numbers make it less likely that Asian Americans and Latinos will challenge them right now for political power, right? That's not true in places like Texas, right? Where the question is always going to be, you know, it's a race for which people of color will sort of get a thing. It's the nature of the beast. So think, for example, about Kamala Harris's seat in California and what's going to happen with that. So if you talk to Black legislators in California who want this seat to remain in the hands of an African-American woman, their fear is that Gavin Newsom will give this to a Latino and probably a Latino man, right? But Latinos are also saying we are a rising power. You know, we aren't particularly well represented in the Senate, and we deserve a seat there. Because part of the problem is both groups know that there are limited numbers of these kinds of opportunities for either group. And so it leads to a kind of competition that sometimes makes it difficult to collaborate. Not impossible, just difficult.
Yeah, I would agree. I think also there are generational differences. Right. One of the things I think that's important to understand is that the Latino community is a complex entity. As I've often said, it's a social construct that was created here in this country as a result of all of these different groups being ostracized, all these different ethnic groups being ostracized by the dominant society, and as a result of the need to pull together at the grassroots level to survive. And one of the reasons that I think explains this 1/3 historic Republican bent of the Latino community, and also a racist trend within the Latino community, is to understand that the class divisions within the community are quite profound. That the reality is that the United States has functioned as the go-to place for elites who are fleeing social upheaval in their own countries. Whether it's the Cubans who migrated in the 60s, the Venezuelans who are migrating now, the Nicaraguans who came in the 80s, and it becomes the base area from which the elite of other countries fleeing social revolution come to be safe. And they then propagate pro-elite perspectives and viewpoints among their populations. So that because of that, and even in the Salvadoran and in the Central American populations, there are class distinctions. And I think that generally speaking, the more upper class and educated the people of Latino descent are, especially those who came from other countries, the more conservative they are. I actually think, and I could be wrong on this, that it's already been demonstrated within the African American community. That people are saying, well, there was a slight increase in the percentage of the vote in the African-American community for Trump. I would ask, who were those voters? And I would be willing to bet, and this is just my own experiential approach, is that there is a high percentage of African immigrants and West Indian immigrants that tend to be more Republican, because the reality is 10% of the Black population in the United States is now immigrant population. They're coming from Ethiopia, and they're coming from Nigeria, and they're coming from Barbados and from Jamaica. And they have a different, sometimes perspective. Fun, they have different educational levels sometimes. They have a different perspective on race, on how they, their own treatment and versus the United States. And sometimes they tend to think more, that they're more superior than domestic African Americans. So I think that the same dynamic is at work in the African American community, but it's definitely at work in the Latino community. And so there is a class war going on in the Latino community over what political parties best represent its interests. And we should not shy away from that. We should understand it exists. We shouldn't apologize for it, because after all, wherever you look, it's only a third of the community, whereas the white community's got to deal with 58, 60% back reactionary politics. And they're not analyzing that, you know? So I think that the issue is there is a class struggle going on in the Latino community, and there may be a more conservative, and I see this in the universities. A lot of Latino professors in these universities were educated in Latin America, and they come from wealthy families, and they have a different perspective than those who grew up here out of poor families, worked their way up, got a college education and a degree, and are now teaching. So there's class struggles going on all the time in these places, and we shouldn't shy away from it. We should confront it directly and say, yes, so what? So let's figure out who represents the best interests of the overwhelming majority of the people.
Because no matter what you think of that 30% of Latinos or however many of Asians, they're not even close in their level of support for the Republican Party as whites. There is a distinct gap between people of color and everybody else, between white people and everybody else, right? And so that is the thing that I think is important as we sort of sort out whether or not Trump got more Black support or more Latino support. But it's also true that if we're not careful and if we don't understand these things very carefully, it leads us to make wrong assumptions and then put out wrong assertions in the public. And so when Florida gets called, people don't realize that there are Cubans there who have been voting Republican, you know, since the Bay of Pigs, and they're like, Latinos have screwed us over. And it's like, wait a minute, no. This was a thing we could have somewhat predicted, right? It is not as surprising. Wait till Mexican Americans start voting in the West. Wait till Puerto Ricans start voting in the Northeast. Like, wait until you have Latinos in the Midwest to start voting. But sometimes because I'm gonna say the media won. So it's sometimes because the media needs to keep talking, they point out these things that are really sort of temporary results in the election. And if you wait half an hour or you wait an hour, you'll see something different, which is why I kept telling everyone I knew to stop watching Steve Kornacki at that screen, because everything he says is meant to terrorize you. And nobody is getting information fast enough for a person to need to stand at that screen for 24 hours.
Right, and I would add there, even for instance, more recent developments. For instance, there was a lot of focus not only on the vote in South Florida, which is largely Cuban, Cuban American, Venezuelan, and Nicaraguan, but there was also focus on Central Florida, which is largely Puerto Rican. But what's happened in the last 4 years? In the last 4 years, a couple of 100,000 Puerto Ricans left the island because of Hurricane Maria, and they fled largely to Central Florida. That's the main place that they went to. And I know, because I know Puerto Rican development very well, that those Puerto Ricans who have come in this last migration wave are much more conservative. Many of them were educated. Many of them were middle class. They gave up with so many crises in Puerto Rico. They finally said, "Oh, I'm a doctor. I'm leaving. I'm an engineer, and I can't take it anymore. I can't find jobs here." So they left. So the new Puerto Ricans in Central Florida are already more conservative than those who existed there before, who are largely retirees from New York and Chicago and other places, who worked in factories and hotels and then retired after their union jobs and moved to Florida because the housing was cheaper. So I think, our communities continue to evolve and change. And those who don't understand the complexity of the development just look for the fast and easy analysis without doing the hard work of understanding what's actually going on.
By the way, one of the things you just reminded me of, one of the other stories that I would put up there in Juan's top 3 is the way in which much of the success across these states that we have been talking about really is due to grassroots organizing and not the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
The Democratic Party is also using old models where they don't think the South is in play, where they don't think places like Arizona is in play. And the thing that has been very interesting is lots of these progressive organizations that have popped up in the last 15 to 20 years, because of their desire to unseat Trump, actually became mobilizers for the Biden-Harris ticket. What's also interesting about that is that means that the Biden-Harris ticket, because it wasn't the Democratic Party doing this, then the Biden-Harris ticket can't control them after this. And so the minute they do something that these groups don't like, they are independent still, and they are well within their rights, and you should expect that they will be protesting them big time. And so that creates a new dilemma for the Democratic Party, I think, where they don't have control over the apparatus. Most of the apparatuses, I don't know, whatever they don't have control over the mechanisms for how they flipped some of these states, right? So they don't control Lucha in Arizona. They don't control Fair Fight in Georgia. They don't control the New Georgia Project. They don't control these organizations, but because of the political circumstances, the interest of these organizations was in tandem with the Biden-Harris campaign. Yeah. And so going forward, that means that these organizations can just as easily mobilize to protest this administration as well. And we don't know for sure whether or not it is yet to be seen whether or not that will actually happen.
That's the perfect transition to the next question that I was going to ask. One thing I wanted to say before we get there, I have a coworker who's a 6-pound, 4-legged Chihuahua who's decided that she needs to play. So you may hear her in the background. So a couple things I wanted to say is that I think that both Juan and Melanie's points about the class war and the geography really matters, and also the really important differential along gender lines. I think that, that's been a significant category in electoral politics, and certainly with Barack Obama's election in 2008 and then 2016, but very clearly in 2016, that question of gender within communities versus using gender within the white community as representative of all, which I think is a problem. So we might think about that too, about where gender fits into this. And then the second thing is the point that both Juan and Melanie have made, is that there was almost of joy in really emphasizing Black and Brown support for Trump. And I think that the unwillingness of the mainstream media to truly reckon with that Trump has been brought to us by the white population cross-class, and that no Democrat has won with the majority of the vote, essentially since the passage of the Voting Rights Act. I think that that's a fact that just can't be said enough. And it was also seen in the practice of the New York Times of continually referring to Trump as a populist rather than as a racist, about this kind of, erasure just of the deeply polarized racial politics, which are of course in continuity with the Republican Party. But there's a way in which, given the explicit racism of Trump and even the repudiation of kind of colorblind dog whistles, this becomes even more important. But there's a kind of discomfort in talking about that. Hence the continual reference, it was a mantra for that first week after the election about the decrease in white male vote for Trump of 2%.
Right. And now that changes everything, and we should, anyway.
Now that changes everything.
So the thing that I wanted to be sure and say about I lost my thought just that fast. What were you talking about? I literally just lost my thought. Like I had a whole thought, but then I just lost it. Keep going. I'll come back to it.
We'll come back to it. So I wanted to talk about the point that you already raised, Melanie, which is that and this fits into Juan's points too, that they were talking about these states simply as if they flipped, especially Arizona
Right.
and Georgia. And given the history of Georgia, Georgia has the largest monument to the Confederacy in all of the United States on Stone Mountain. And interestingly enough, like the Dixiecrat Democratic Party holds on much, much longer in Georgia. And you don't actually see this Republic ascendance until relatively recently. And what was very frustrating in the coverage was the complete ignoring of Stacey Abrams and Fair Fight and other organizers like Latasha Brown.
Yes.
But I was also just struck by the really just not even talking about the demographics, even of a state like Georgia. And I would add, during Biden's selection for the vice president, there was a story that I assume was purposely leaked about Biden not appointing Stacey Abrams because she had been essentially too aggressive in pursuing.
Right. She was too thirsty, as they say.
Yeah, she was too aggressive. And I was just really struck by that. You all can speak to this better, but even the level of hostility that was shown towards Abrams, and then given the role that she played and other Black women played in getting out the vote in Georgia. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that. Tell us about Fair Fight. Tell us about more details about who these grassroots organizers are and why we had the outcome in Georgia we did.
So Stacey Abrams is, I am a fan. So that's like not even politically objective. That's not about political science. I am a fan of Stacey Abrams. Part of the reason is because I remember nearly 10 years ago when she was having this Turn Georgia Blue project and people were laughing. And they were like, this is a ridiculous prospect. But what Stacey Abrams has done is modeled what we've always known about the South. And that is that there are lots of people of color and particularly lots of Black people in the South. And they're all over these states. But because of voter suppression, the impact of their votes have not always worked out in ways that we would like. And so she decides that she's going to, rather than try to convert white conservatives to vote for her when she runs for governor, she is going to register as many Black, Brown, Asian American people as she possibly can. And she does that. And that is the thing that puts her in play when she runs for governor in 2018. And it is that same mechanism it's Fair Fight, it's the New Georgia Project, it's Black Votes Matter, but it's also sort of other grassroots organizations that work with them as well, who have come together. So for instance, the day that they knew there would be a runoff for the Senate seats, those people were meeting, they were prepared, they were ready to go. And that is the thing that I think is different. I think it's the same case in Arizona. By the way, lots of these organizations also have become prominent because they are, so for instance, Lucha came into existence really because of the Show Your Papers laws in Arizona, right? Black Votes Matter is inspired by BLM. And so these are groups that are not coming up as traditional civil rights groups. They are much younger than traditional civil rights groups, and they are more progressive, more left.
Thank you for that. Juan, did you have thoughts on this subject?
Yeah, no, basically, I would completely agree that this whole effort of the grassroots movements that have developed, that have really sort of supplanted the old organizational apparatus that existed previously that the Democratic Party depended on, which was the labor unions, getting out their members through their phone banks and their volunteering on election day. That groups like Fair Fight and like Lucha, Mi Gente, and first of all, they're completely young people. In the case of the Latino community, they're mostly folks who have come out of the immigrant rights movement and the Dreamers, and so they are beholden to no one except, many of them were Bernie Sanders supporters in the primaries, but then understood that the key question at this point was getting the Trump cabal out of the White House, and so they were actively working independently. Now the question does become, yes, I think they're going to be more independent than were the young people during in the time when Obama came into office. But the Obama administration was very good at attempting to, if not co-opt, at least attempt to control the grassroots movements. And they were constantly trying to manage the grassroots movement to prevent them from pressuring them. I don't think the Biden administration is going to have as much success, but they will have some. There's always a tendency to attempt to co-opt the most outspoken and most eloquent and the best leaders into a relationship with a new administration. So we'll have to see, but I do think that they are definitely starting out much more independent than was the grassroots movement that was behind Obama in 2008. And they are going to pose much more of a challenge to the Democratic Party corporate establishment.
Thank you for that. I wanted to underline something that Melanie said, and Latasha Brown had an extensive interview on Deconstructed and talked about this, which is the podcast for The Intercept. And she said that up until Stacey Abrams' gubernatorial run, that much of the logic, and this speaks to the larger question when we were talking about Black and brown coalitions, and Melanie talked about the sense of scarcity, like the fight over Kamala's seat. Well, part of the reason that scarcity exists is because the disproportionate attention that's given to white voters, this infinite search for, trying to capture a portion of the white population, even though, as we know, no Democrat has been elected with a majority of the white vote since LBJ, since 1965. So that's part of what's creating the scarcity. And her argument was that it was 23% was the average that Democrats were able to get. And the idea is if they could exceed, I think it was 26%, if they could capture a small portion of the white population, this was considered the way to win. And what Stacey Abrams did was throw that out entirely and say, no, let's do voter registration. Let's bring in this population, which is part of the historic population of Georgia. And I just think that's important because this fight in Georgia, to me, is also indicative of the larger problem with the Democratic Party. It's also convincingly, many people have argued in looking at the outcome of the down ballot elections, that the emphasis on the capture of these white middle class voters, especially in the swing states, also might explain why Biden won on the presidential ticket, but then the Republicans gained seats, that it's also the apportionment of resources. And I think it's George Rusha who's talked about just the political economy of how campaigns are run, that you have very few Black and brown consultancy groups that are involved with this, and it's a relatively small, sealed world of how these campaigns are run. And it remains the search for the elusive white Democratic voter. So I want to make sure.
Here's the thing that I think will trouble those waters. Lots of Black women candidates don't have access to that political class, right? And so when you put them in power, you also have a different group of people who are working behind the scenes in their campaigns. I mean, this will sort of be the question for Kamala Harris as well, right? When she becomes the presumptive nominee. And that is, will she go with the typical, Democrats who normally run the Democratic Party, or will she look for outside people? Because if you think about people like in St. Louis, her name is Cori Bush in St. Louis. There's nothing about her that comes out of sort of the traditional political campaign class. And so the more you put women, especially women of color, in place, the more you supplant the impact that those people have on how campaigns are directed. And that's one of the things that we started to see. Oh, the other thing I was going to see also, the way you know that Georgia is also doing something different and they're not just searching for white voters is if you listen to Jon Ossoff. People are happy to say that Raphael Warnock is Black, and so he was going to say this stuff anyway. But listen to how Jon Ossoff talks about who is voting for him in Georgia. And he talks about how it is a multiracial coalition. It is primarily people of color. He is having a completely different kind of discussion about his election prospects than Joe Biden, who is still sort of on this unity thing, right? That's not what Jon Ossoff is saying. Jon Ossoff is like, here are the people who are voting for me. Here's the way we are going to win. And I'm going to say the things to those people. And so that actually shows, I think, the difference at the state and federal level.
Thank you for that. So this will be my last question, because I want to make sure that we have a chance for a discussion, and we have a lot of people who are here who I know want to talk to you too. But I wanted to end by talking about a tape that was recently linked, and you can hear the full tape on the internet's podcast on Deconstructed. Recently, a rather disturbing tape was leaked about Joe Biden's meeting with civil rights leaders. He took an aggressive stance on the importance of holding back on calls for defunding the police and other criminal justice reforms, as well as instructing them not to criticize the choice of Tom Vilsack for Secretary of Agriculture. The candidate that many people wanted for this job was Marcia Fudge. And
Marcia Fudge, yes.
Incredibly important given the scale of hunger. There was a recent survey that said that 41% of African Americans who responded to the survey said they were food insecure, and the New York Times cites 1 in 8 people. So this is an incredibly important position. But Biden was adamant about this, about do not criticize, and he literally linked defunding the police to criticizing essentially someone that came from the corporate sector being appointed as the Secretary of Agriculture. His tone was punitive and angry, with its insistence that they trust him and not interfere with the elections in Georgia by expressing quote unquote unpopular opinions. So I guess the question I want to ask is, since you are journalists and political scientists, you will feel comfortable with this. I'm a historian, so I hate being asked to predict, but I'm wondering if you can just talk about some of the challenges of the Biden administration and the kind of tension that in many ways that our candidate is from the right wing of the Democratic Party after we've seen the largest protest movement in total numbers in history around issues of state violence. So kind of what you see and what you foresee in the coming months and years.
I'm gonna let Juan predict first, and then
Well, I would say that it's going to be a challenge on many fronts. I think I'm actually much more worried on the foreign policy front than I am on the domestic front, that clearly Biden is going to pretty much carry on, I believe, the Obama-Hillary Clinton policies around the world, and that's going to be an issue that we're going to have to deal with. Yes, he will probably try to come up with some accommodation in terms of the Iran nuclear deal and certainly rejoin the Paris Climate Accords. But on many other issues, he's going to be as belligerent as chasing after the return of the imperial power of the United States, as most other presidents have been in the past. And I think that's my main concern. And I do think that, Biden is not, there's an extreme authoritarian side to him as well. And I think that he doesn't brook a lot of dissent. And we've already seen a reconstitution of a lot of old Obama people are coming back. I just read in the paper today, Terry McAuliffe wants to run for governor of Virginia again, and he already has Biden's support against a few much more progressive people. So the center and the right of the Democratic Party are going to attempt to reassert themselves. The progressives are going to have to battle, and they're going to have to stand up and challenge him. But at the same time, I think, I'm one that, while I believe that there are major restructurings of the police departments around the United States that have to occur, I do think that the left, in pushing this slogan of defund the police, I don't believe that is the best slogan to put forth at this time. Now, I think that there has to be reduction of funding. I think there has to be a restructuring of policing in America. But I think the simple slogan just to defund the police doesn't really get to the heart of what has to happen with policing in America. And so I could understand why some of them are concerned about it in the Democratic Party, but I don't think that the way he's approaching this, which is to basically tell them, shut up, trust me, I know what I'm doing, is the right way to go.
Yeah, mostly because no one trusts him. I mean, no one trusts anybody at this moment. And so to ask anybody to trust anybody, it seems like a ridiculous request. But I think part of the thing that we have to understand for Biden, his biography is really important. And that is when you think about the ways that he came up in politics, he came up in politics in a moment where senators from all sides, like they would filibuster the civil rights bill and the other side would vote in support of it. And they would go out to dinner. And their kids did stuff together and they were friends. And this is the way in which he sees as the ideal political stance. And because he sees this as ideal, it is going to want him to do two things. One is to tap into those old buddies. And those old buddies are now solidly establishment moderate Democrats. The other thing that is going to lead him to want to do is to reach across the aisle. I think we should buck against both of those things. Calling on his old buddies is to ignore the fact that he was elected in a new form, using a new model of democratic politics, and to not reward the people who actually got him there, I think is problematic. And I think it's also problematic because he likely knows that he'll be a one-term president. And so it won't set the Democratic Party up well in 2024 if he alienates all the people who helped him get there. The other part of this is this desire to reach across the aisle. You know, I'm not president of just Democrats. I'm president of all people. Like, I loved all of that stuff prior to Trump. Because part of the thing that is important to note about Trumpism is that it is intransigent. It is unmoving. It is belligerent. And so the only way you can shake their hand is to move over to their side. And so I don't know. And so because of that, it feels to me sometimes when I hear people talk about unification, it feels to me like a unification of white voters. And that always comes at the expense of people of color. And so if he starts to talk about this unity with these, I mean, how do you unify with Mitch McConnell?
You don't.
Exactly. And how do you unify with Mitch McConnell without being an enemy to poor people, to people of color? How do you do this without being an enemy to the environment? And so in this moment, the desire for him to recreate this fabulous idea of this great Senate that he was a part of, or this great Washington government where people disagree with each other and then hung out later. First of all, almost none of that included people of color. And so we have to really work hard to push that he, like, when I saw that he put Marsha Fudge in housing and urban development, that's the black slot. That's the black slot. It's like if you see upper management at in a university, if you see a person of color in the cabinet of a president, it's often they're over student affairs, not provost of academic affairs. Because academic affairs is an intellectual job. Student affairs is just wrangling kids. One requires intellect, one does not. And people view HUD as a lower cabinet position. And so the question is, what is he going to do in those things that matter? And is he listening to the people that are important? And this is why the most hopeful thing I see coming out of this is the independence of a lot of these groups that got him elected.
Yeah.
Because they don't have to feel bad about, well, let me say this. They don't have to feel bad about challenging him, but also the thing that is good about this is there are no racial obligations that prevent them from wanting to do so. So Black people talk crazy to Joe Biden all they want in ways they wouldn't to Barack Obama.
Yeah.
There's no history to preserve. There's none of that stuff, right? And so and by the way, they would talk crazy to Biden and to a Black woman, but that's a whole nother gender conversation. And the thing that we need to know about that is we have to watch Biden and his efforts to unify.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to make a comment, and please, we need questions in the chat. Please put your question.
Can I also say that people keep sending me comments in the chat, but my chat, oh, it's working now. Okay, go ahead. No.
So one thing I wanted to say, and this is a painful truth for me, but I think that it's obvious. If people have been paying attention, it is very clear, going back to the Obama administration, I mean, President Obama himself realized this by the second half of his term, that he had to act by executive order because there was no reaching across the aisle. And I think that the discourse of reaching across the aisle is actually not about Republicans. This has to do with a battle inside the Democratic Party and its own relationship to its donor class. So I think that part is really important, like not to believe the rhetoric of the two-party system, that there's a question about the battle inside the Democratic Party. Of course, we also saw this in the immediate aftermath of the presidential elections. The bloodbath that took place with the attack on Rashida Tlaib, on Ilhan Omar, of Black Lives Matter, for the kind of mobilization that we've all agreed was essential. So it's very clear that Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, they did much of the door knocking in Minnesota and Detroit, in these core Midwestern states that really mattered. 40% of the Democratic Party in the House counts itself as part of the Progressive Caucus. This is an essential piece of the Democratic Party right now. In many ways, it is the future of the Democratic Party. If you look at the demographics,
it's the future because of sheer numbers.
Because of numbers, but also it's many different things. I think there's a political economy question. There's the downward mobility of young people. There's the correlation between age and income. So that's something else just to project into this about that question of the left wing of the Democratic Party and how it fits in with this Black and brown demographics. I was living in Southern California from 2013 to 2015 and maintained those ties with a lot of left, kind of organized left and labor forces in California. And the depth of support, even among the organized left, for Bernie was incredible. Yeah. So I think that's also something up for us to think about, that Biden's framing of bipartisanship isn't only about Republicans. Yeah. Certainly Biden is watching this and everyone else is watching it. The majority of Republicans are not even acknowledging that he's president. And so I think bipartisanship actually has a different meaning. Rant over. So we have a question in the chat from Nancy. Nancy, would you like to say your comment in person?
Sure, thank you. I wanted 2 points of clarification addressed, if possible. One is, there seemed to be a discussion as if the Edison polls, in fact, were relatively accurate, but it seems that this election is so unusual because there was this effort to try to get Republicans to vote on election day and Democrats voting mostly by mail. So it seems to me there's a really high chance that the exit polls were not at all representative. And then the second issue is that there's a fair amount of evidence that people vote based on their view of the economy in the 6 months before the election. And it seemed that an awful lot of people essentially did not blame Trump for his handling of COVID and what happened to the economy, because they claimed it wasn't his fault. And they gave him credit for what was happening to the economy in pre-COVID. And then in addition to that, it seems that a lot of people, and maybe Black and brown people in particular, were concerned about a potential new shutdown that might threaten their jobs. And so they might have voted for Trump in part because of their fear that their jobs would be even more threatened with Democrats in power who might do another shutdown because of the COVID crisis.
One of the things I'll say about the Edison polls is those polls are not meant to give us a good picture of what the American voter electorate looked like. Their goal really is to predict who's going to win on election night and to be able to call that with enough certainty and as early as possible so that news outlets can report and do commentary before people go to bed. And so the thing that people don't realize is that those numbers are adjusted all the time. So you have all exit polls look one way on election night. And then if you go look at them 4 months later, they have been adjusted for mistakes that were made on election night. That's one thing. The other thing is those polls are good at predicting certain populations. And so not necessarily people of color. And so all of those things make it very tricky. And it also makes it tricky because one of the things we know is that African Americans in many states are overrepresented in early voting. And if you're not tracking who's voting in early voting, then you miss many, many African Americans. And so you already know you're going to get a more conservative result on election day. All of those things are things that are important. Now, the question about the economy. Look, this 2020 is very hard for us to say who. I think it's very hard to say who was voting for what reason because it's 2020 and things are up in the air about everything. But I do think that a lot of this, one of the things I'll say, by the way, is that watching Trump supporters is unlike watching any other presidential supporters because they, in the face of, they are willing to say, like, you can be like, the sky is blue, and they are willing to say, no, not if Trump says it isn't. And that's a kind of loyalty that is not based in logic. It's based in certain kinds of emotions, certain kinds of fears, and those kinds of things. And so the thing that we don't have a good grip on and that people should probably spend a lot of time, I think, studying is trying to understand who are these people. Now, it's going to be very difficult because it turns out that they also are now super skeptical of everybody. Everybody. And also, in this election, you normally don't see in elections, people don't normally know where you count votes.
Yeah.
That's a weird aberration of this election. People don't know where you count votes. They don't go to that place and try to storm it. And it's always been public. You could always witness it in lots of places, and there's never people there. And so all of those things tell us a lot about the fact that it's hard to predict one thing. Now, was it your experience with the economy that led you to think that Trump was doing a good job? Maybe. Mm-hmm. Was it something else? Who knows? I don't know if you agree with that one, but I just find it very hard to understand what is the thing that people are latching on to in this election, besides, white supremacy.
Well, I think as the American Election Eve poll that I mentioned earlier showed, in terms of the Latino community, the number one issue was coronavirus response. And I think that that was the number one issue for those who voted. I just want to add that I don't think that we were saying that the Edison poll was accurate. I think what what I was saying was that there was a small percentage increase in the Trump vote of among Latinos compared to previously, but that wasn't the main story. The main story was the phenomenal turnout, and and why did so many more people come out to vote this time than last time? Well, you could argue part of it was the extended mail voting and early voting that made it easier for people to vote, but that's part of it. But I think a big part of it was that people felt more strongly the need to vote. And then you have to ask yourself, who came out the most compared to previous times? And that was Latinos and people of color. So are you going to argue over the fact that a couple of percentage points increase in the vote for Trump, or are you going to argue that so many more people came out to vote and that 2-to-1 they voted against Trump. I think that's the key thing to understand. You know, as for the polls themselves, 100 million people voted before Election Day, 59 million people voted on Election Day. The Edison poll undersampled early voters and oversampled Election Day voters. So that was part of how their stuff got skewed up. They never expected that 100 million people were going to vote before the election. So that was part of the systemic problems that their poll had.
Thank you for that. So we have a bunch of questions, so I'm going to take two at a time. We have Belinda and Ian. Belinda?
Hi, sorry for that. I just, thanks for these presentations, Juan and Melanie, and also for organizing this, Donna. Donna, you at least won't be surprised by my question, but in light of so many of the trends that you've identified from below and also the continuities from above, from Hillary-style regime change in Guatemala and endless wars to Biden's rejection of change regarding policing and so on, what are the real and increasingly realistic alternatives to the existing party structures that may now be in the future? Is there really no chance for young progressives and all the new voters of color and so on to start voting boldly for non-duopoly parties, like, for example, the Greens, casting off kind of species stasisist arguments of spoilers and the like? Don't we need a larger vision and not accept the existing structures, including those that mainstream media organs and even all the more maybe putatively progressive outlets absolutely reinforce with a kind of extraordinary lockstep?
Thank you for that, Belinda. Ian?
Sorry, I was muted. My question was actually for someone who came in from YouTube, who I think is logged on. Dr. Asuji, could you unmute and ask your question?
Sure, I can definitely do that. So thank you for noticing my question on YouTube. I've been waiting to ask it. So thank you guys for organizing this. Hi, Donna, again. And thank you so much. It's so wonderful to hear all of your perspectives. Thank you, Melanie, and of course, Juan González. So my question is, what are the new GOP strategies that we should be anticipating? Like, what are the new ways that we might anticipate that they might decide to gerrymander or create new ways that would disenfranchise Black and Latino voters? I'd like to hear your perspectives on that. Thank you.
So the alternative parties question, that's where the American politics person in me comes out and just say that part of the problem with third parties is, you know, in the way the government in America is set up, they just don't win at the national level. And people want to back parties that win. And what the larger parties do is when they see third parties having a winning argument, they just suck that argument into their party structure, right? That's been harder to do. I think the Tea Party on the right, and I think the new progressives, the new left on the left, cause questions about how easy that's going to be in this particular moment. But generally, the large parties just say your issue was great, and then they try to suck it up, take it away from you, and they have the money, the mechanisms, and the people to do it. And so part of it, the only way for third parties to thrive is for us, beyond the more local and state level, is for us to actually change the voting structure that's built into the Constitution, which is essentially that's built into how we understand elections, which is essentially winner take all. And as long as you have winner take all, it's going to favor two really big parties. There's a whole thing called Duverger's law that explains it. But that doesn't mean, by the way, that third parties don't play really important roles. They do, because they shape sometimes. What they do is they do a really good job of forcing, when third parties have traction, they force the larger parties to pay attention to whatever issue that is pulling people towards the alternative party. And so they immediately then have to make a statement, take a stand on that particular thing. Do you want to answer the question about alternative parties, Juan, and then we'll go to the next one, or should I just go to the next one?
Well, just quickly on alternative parties, I think I agree that there's the efforts to co-opt the positions or not only co-opt the positions, but make it impossible for them to survive.
Yes.
Is so great. I mean, we're just seeing now, for instance, Andrew Cuomo in New York was so fed up with the Working Families Party that he got the legislature to increase the amount of votes necessary to qualify as a third party, to make it even more difficult for them. The voters approved ranked choice voting in New York City, and now there are Black officials who are running for mayor who are saying that ranked choice voting will hurt the African-American community. Eric Adams is saying that, and some of the other candidates. So they're trying to find ways to prevent a breakup of the power of the two-party system. My basic problem is that I don't believe, as someone who's always had revolutionary perspectives, that the United States is anywhere near moving in a revolutionary or radical direction. In fact, we are the rear guard. We are the imperial power of the world. We are the rear guard of revolutionary and progressive movements throughout the world. The best that we can hope for in this country is to reframe the power, the imperial power of the country, while revolutions develop in other parts of the world. But that there's too many Americans who are invested in imperialism, and they enjoy being the great power of the world. And so we're not going to be able to radicalize the American electorate in a qualitative way. All we can do is hold back the ability of this imperial power to continue to crush people around the world and to crush the American people as well.
Thank you for that. We only have a few minutes left. So if you guys can respond to the second question with some brevity, and then I'll just have the final questions asked, and then each of you can respond. We have about 10 minutes left.
Okay. If you look at the strategies of the Republican Party over the last decade or so, one of the things that you'll see is that they clearly see what's coming down the road. They understand that demography, that persuasiveness, that youth, none of these things are on their side. And so basically they're doing a couple of things to figure out how they're going to keep winning despite not having the numbers. One is obviously, these are the things that I think are tied into that. One obviously is voter suppression, and that is purging of rolls, changing election days and locations, not giving people of color enough machines, power outages that only happen in particular neighborhoods, all of those kinds of things. But I would also, by the way, put two other issues in that same thing. One is this whole move towards anti-immigration. And that is because the people who are going to migrate now are people who are likely Democrats. And they don't want more Democrats. And so they are trying to make it harder to immigrate. And the third thing I would add to that is the questions about birthright citizenship. Who are the people who are having the most children? How is it that all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we have started to question birthright citizenship? And so I think those three things are about limiting the populations that support the Democratic Party and their access to the ballot, rather than actually figuring out a way to persuade people to actually buy into their principles and beliefs.
Juan, did you have a response?
No, that's good.
Okay, wonderful. So, all right, we have a number of people in the chat, but we won't have time to get to all of them. Kathleen and Leo, and unfortunately those have to be the final questions of the night. I want to save time for us to get an update from Juan about Lincoln Annex, and also David Hughes is going to talk to us about the SAS meeting on Monday.
Yeah, Donna, I'm going to pass my question so you can go right to Leo. Thank you, though.
Thank you, everybody. It's been super fascinating and provocative. I guess just real quick, since Black-Brown Coalition is part of the theme here, I just wanted to have you all talk more about that because, you know, some slogans have been raised, and like issues like imperialism have been raised too, you know, and there seem to be some competing interests. And in the same way that, you know, unifying across the aisle with Republicans is ridiculous, the unification of people of color has been really critiqued, especially during this election. And particularly like the Latinx community itself, it seems almost like the at the moment in which Latinx population here is taking over, it's also crumbling apart from within in terms of, you know, questioning what really is a community and its role in politics in the United States. So just any commentary on that?
Well, I wouldn't agree that the perspective of some commentators that the Latino community is crumbling from within is accurate. As I said before, there's been a historical trend throughout the history of the United States in politics that about 1/3 of Latinos vote Republican, about 2/3 vote Democrat. It hasn't changed. If there was a substantial change one way or another, that would be something to remark upon. But the reality is the community is complex. However, the Latino community continues to grow in the sense that the different Latino nationalities, and you know, in Miami, Cubans marry Venezuelans or Colombians. In New York, they marry between Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, and Los Angeles between Salvadorans and Mexicans, and their children are this new entity, the Latino in the United States. They trace their heritage in different ways, complex ways. And so in essence, out of all the different nationalities and the class compositions of these nationalities emerges a new thing, which is the Latino or the Latinx community in the United States. It's going to continue to grow. It's going to continue to develop. It's going to continue to be more complicated. But generally speaking, since the masses of Latinos are working class and lower middle class, they will tend to affiliate more to the party that best represents their interests.
It's also important, I think, for all of us to think of all of these communities. I think sometimes that we should think about these kinds of debates amongst each other as healthy and robust, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And that we within communities should always be trying to talk about the things that we think are important. Even in the African-American community where, for instance, you know, they talk about all of these different people and then 85% of them vote for the same person. That doesn't mean that they aren't having sort of robust discussions within themselves about politics, about the political strategy. And so sometimes it's easy to see these disagreements because people love to focus on the disagreements as unhealthy, but they're not. And there will be more of them. These young, especially in the Latinx community, these people are young, but they're also going to run for office. They're going to get old. Then new younger people are going to call them sellouts. And then they will, I mean, I grew up in Houston. I have seen people who were activists become city council members and mayors, and then the young people protest them. It is the cycle of life. It is the way things happen. And these young people more and more will move into, I think, electoral politics, and then they will become the old guard that younger people are trying to get rid of.
Thank you so much for that. So before we close, I want to say a few things. The first is that Juan González is going to give us an update about what's going on with Lincoln Annex. And David Hughes will be following Juan, talking about the SAS meeting, which is coming up on Monday. We hope to see all of you there. And then finally, in this second Freedom School, we have instituted a new element, which is the after party. So we'll have kind of informal discussion afterwards. So I would love to see you all in the after party, and you maybe should start refilling your drinks. Juan?
Yeah, just quickly, we've been involved for more than a year here in New Brunswick in a battle to save a public middle school here in downtown New Brunswick called the Lincoln Annex School. We're trying to save it from Rutgers University and from Robert Wood Johnson Hospital, both of whom have allied together to attempt to build. They want to buy the school, which is across the street from the existing Robert Wood Johnson Hospital, from the existing Rutgers Cancer Institute, and demolish it and build on top of the site a $750 million standalone cancer pavilion. The school, though, has 750 students, 94% of them Latino. It is the best performing school in the city of New Brunswick. It's a relatively new building that the city spent $22 million refurbishing and reopening 4 years ago. And just because Robert Wood Johnson and Rutgers want that piece of land for their new medical expansion, they have been able to get the entire political superstructure of New Brunswick and Middlesex County to agree to sell the school, tear it down, and give it over. And they're offering to build a new school sometime down the road, a few years from now. And meanwhile, the kids are being sent to a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town to be taught. And so there's been a huge community struggle. The students of Rutgers have been involved, the faculty, the union. We've been fighting for a year. The COVID pandemic made it tough. We've had lawsuits in the courts. We have all this long battle. The long and the short is that they keep moving forward, even in the midst of the pandemic, but they still have not been able to sell the school. And we are continuing to do everything possible to put pressure on the university and on Robert Wood Johnson Hospital to not do this, which is going to be continuing to gentrify downtown New Brunswick. A city that is 55% Latino, is low income for the most part, and that Rutgers, as President Holloway just boasted about creating a new institute for racial justice, a global racial justice, is actually perpetuating a racist gentrification right next door, right among its own neighbors. And we think that this is totally morally bankrupt, and we are continuing to do whatever we can to stop it.
Thank you so much for that, Juan. Is there a way that viewers can be involved?
Well, they can go to the Facebook page, Save Lincoln Annex, and hashtag Save Lincoln Annex, and you can get all the information on all the activities that we have, and that's the best way to stay informed through the Facebook page of the community.
Thank you so much for that. David, would you like to give us an update about the SAS meeting?
Sure. Thank you, Donna. And thank you, Donna and Juan and Melanie, for a thrilling Freedom School session here. So I'm David Hughes. I'm the treasurer of the union and a faculty member in anthropology in New Brunswick. A lot is going on in SAS, which I'll describe in the School of Arts and Sciences, New Brunswick, that is, which I'll describe very briefly. As you know, the administration has been imposing worse austerity than ever before and justifying this in the name of the pandemic. As you also probably know, this is a false austerity and a Naomi Klein style shock doctrine, because the administration has still $600 million in unrestricted reserves laid aside, they used to say, for an emergency, and they are refusing to spend that money. They're also lying in various ways about the financial impact of COVID, which is really not very severe at all. So the union in coalition with all the other unions has been fighting this at the macro level. At the micro level, faculty have been fighting against the 20 layoffs that our Dean Peter Murch is in the process of implementing, 20 layoffs of staff, academic staff. We've also been fighting against the much larger number of layoffs of part-time lecturers that he's been implementing. And both of those cuts have enormous impacts, very negative impacts on students and on full-time faculty as well. So we called for an emergency meeting back in October, which resulted in a resolution that 400 faculty, that is half of the school supported, but 93% of those who voted supported this resolution calling upon Peter Murch to cease and desist and reverse those cuts. He threw that back in our face and refused to do anything. So we are coming together now for the regularly scheduled faculty meeting on Monday morning, where through petition, again, we have 3 agenda items. Those people, we will have testimonials from people facing layoffs. We will hold Peter Murch to account for his actions, and we will vote on another resolution to try to make good on accountability. and to compel him to consult with a faculty committee on the nature of the SAS budget and on the resources available to SAS at higher levels. So this is a really important step for, of course, for the individuals whose livelihoods are at stake. It's also a really important step for the principle of faculty-led governance and for financial accountability of the dean class. So those of you who are SAS faculty members, full-time faculty members, you're all entitled to come and vote. You will have gotten the invitation from Dean Murch. Todd and Becky sent out a reminder. Oh no, excuse me, it wasn't from Todd and Becky. It was from Andrew Goldstone and Carlos and Anna Pere. So yeah, but you'll be getting reminders, and you can always email me if you want the link. If you're grads, you might be interested to observe this because, of course, we're all fighting the same fight against austerity. And I hope that a victory in the School of Arts and Sciences will resonate across other schools as faculty, as we use the governance tools that we can for these smaller battles in the midst of a much larger struggle. So that's it. It's at 10 a.m. The link has been sent out on Monday, School of Arts and Sciences faculty meeting. Thank you. Thank you, Donna.
Thank you so much, David. Lucy Jean, my coworker, has just intervened to say that she hopes to see you all at the SAS meeting at 10 o'clock. The after party is going to happen on this link, so just stay here. We'll all be here. And I'd like to give a resounding applause, Zoom applause, to Juan and Melanie for their incredible presentation. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't know you when I was there, Juan. This was a lot of fun. Take care. I'm gonna go. See you later.